All right. We're winding down the kings of Judah, and that means we're winding down the class. And this is the last time I will be teaching. Scott will be teaching on Sunday. And I wanted to thank these guys who have helped in teaching the class. They've all done a great job. I want to thank all of you for participating in it. Without an audience, it surely wouldn't be much of a class. And you all have been a good one, so thank you for that. The paper that was just passed out is a combination of all the texts of tonight's lesson. And I have added to those texts that showed up in your schedule, Lamentations chapter 4 and verses 3 through 10, because Jeremiah in the book of Lamentations gives a very graphic depiction of the siege placed on Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar's army when we get to that point. I think you'll find it easier to follow my slides because the text bounces back and forth to just follow on this handout because it will take you through the text in a chronological order. I needed to do that for myself because when you're studying for a class like this, it's hard to study from 3 different books at the same time and make any kind of a synthesis of the material. Since I went to the trouble, I decided that you all might as well have it as well. But my slides are laid out in the order that is presented in this outline, so following along with that instead of in your Bibles will be a lot easier for you, I think. Let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, we're thankful, and we should be thankful for all the many things that you have done for us and continue to do for us, not the least of which is to bring these good brothers and sisters together to put your word in front of us so that we can open it and that we can learn from it, learn more about how we can be pleasing to you and how we can live more successful lives in your presence and how we can have a close relationship with you now through your Son, Jesus Christ. We ask your blessings, Father, on those among us who have different kinds of ailments and sickness. We ask you to bless us, continue to bless this congregation with good spiritual health and with unity and love. And we thank you for showing us the way. In Jesus' name, amen. So tonight we're talking about Zedekiah and the end of Jerusalem. Here is I call it the primary text. There is so much redundancy among these texts. And when I say redundancy, 3 of the 4 books you see listed up there have texts that are almost verbatim and identical in the sections that we're talking about tonight. That's not always the case, but it is for this section of text. We're going to begin by giving you a little bit of background and history about Nebuchadnezzar II, because he's the king of Babylon at the time that all this happens. And of course, we've been talking about him some already, but let's just get a broad background on him. Let's bring you up to speed on where Jerusalem and Judea are at the time that these events take place, and then we'll launch into the text itself. So Nebuchadnezzar II is the son of Nabopolassar, and by many historians' estimations, Nabopolassar was the greatest king of Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar was second only to him. He was co-regent and co-military commander with his father, and that's significant because Nabopolassar seems to have taught Nebuchadnezzar great skills as a strategist and a tactician in battle. He considered himself to be the appointee of the gods, and he himself honored Marduk above all because he was Babylon's chief god. And in fact, in his younger years, he was tasked with rebuilding the temple to Marduk in Babylon at the command of his father. I'm going to start. My chief complaint about Nebuchadnezzar II is his name takes up too much room on a slide, so I'm going to start abbreviating him as you see here. That's Nebuchadnezzar II, okay? Successful commander-in-chief. In his military conquests against Egypt. This was kind of the first major responsibility he had over his father's army. And he mopped up the floor with Egypt at Carchemish and at Hamath. Egypt sustained heavy losses, and Babylon came away with almost none, very minimal losses. So this was very successful for these first campaigns on his own. Once his father died, he went back to Babylon and he secured his throne within 3 weeks after his father's death. So there wasn't much of a transition period. Everybody knew who the next king was going to be, and didn't seem to be much of a quibble about it. He continued extensive military campaigns in Syria and Palestine after his father's death, because Syria kept trying to resurrect its own government and power over Babylon, and Babylon insisted on keeping Syria under wraps. Palestine, as you know already from the biblical text that we've already studied, the kings of Judah also continued to cause trouble for Babylon until they finally put an end to that as well. He sustained heavy losses himself, though, in trying to enter Egypt to bring Egypt into the Babylonian Empire in about 601. So right before his campaign in Palestine to finally bring Judah under control, with just a few years before that, he suffered a major military defeat. And Jerusalem then, of course, was destroyed in 587, and you might see that number differ by a year or two, depending on who the historian was who dated it. He rebuilt and fortified Babylon. He was struck mad, as you recall, by God for 7 years, acting like an animal, but was generally looked upon by the Jews favorably. Probably mainly because the prophets of Judah spoke favorably about him, in the sense that he was an instrument that was being used by God for the correction of God's people. And so when the Jews were taken to Babylon, they weren't treated so badly in Babylon. They were pretty much allowed to live their own life there, except for the military commanders who rose up against him, and he treated them pretty harshly, as he was accustomed to doing. Let's talk now a little bit about Judah and Jerusalem at the time of Nebuchadnezzar. The reforms of Hezekiah and Josiah, as you know, were short-lived. Hezekiah made these sweeping reforms, and within a couple years they were gone. And then Josiah came back, and he had to redo everything that Hezekiah had done, but it didn't affect the hearts of the people. It was just superficial. It was real for Josiah, but it was superficial for a lot of the people. And so although Manasseh repented, his damage that he had done after Hezekiah was persistent, continued to remain with the Jews for the rest of their history. The leadership was idolatrous, and this comes from the prophets who were prophesying to Judah at the time of these kings. The leadership was idolatrous, it was unconcerned for the poor, it was unjust, and these are the constant complaints that God had against the leadership. Judah had the practices of the pagans. Apparently there was a comment, I believe it was in Zephaniah, about when they entered a house, how they had to jump over the threshold. This is a practice in much of the East even till now. In China, if you go into a Buddhist temple, there'll be a raised doorway about that high to trip up the spirits as they go in. Somehow spirits are not smart enough to jump over the threshold, I guess. And the Chinese, when they go to the Buddhist temple, they will not step on that threshold. They will step over it as a way of keeping the evil spirits out. So they had picked up this habit. The Judahites had picked up this habit, and among their other maladies, they were dishonest in commerce. They were complacent and violent, and we're going to find out just how violent in just a minute when we talk about Jehoiakim. Nebuchadnezzar had previously subjugated Jehoiakim, as you'll recall. This was in our previous lesson. He pilfered the temple and he required tribute from him. Jehoiakim then rebelled. He thought he was going to lean on Egypt for help, and the Egyptians did him no good at all. Nebuchadnezzar then laid siege to the city, bound Jehoiakim, and took him to Babylon, where he died an inglorious death. Jehoiakim was succeeded by his son Jehoiachin. He was deposed by Nebuchadnezzar after 3 months, so he didn't last long on the throne before Nebuchadnezzar installed Zedekiah, his uncle, in his place, the brother of Jehoiakim. And that brings us to where we are today. So here's the narrative. Pay attention to that combined text handout that just went around. If you don't have one of those, maybe you can. One of these guys that handed them out can tell you. I've got some of them up here if you want to come get one. Thank you. This handout is based mainly on 2 Chronicles account because it is the most inclusive in terms of covering all the text. And then I've just intercalated the text with texts from these other sources so that it all makes a fairly smooth narrative. Most of the text of the 3 accounts, as I said before, are identical. I mean, verbatim for the most part. I only inserted the ones that differ and tried to place them chronologically on the sheet. So let's talk about Zedekiah. Zedekiah was how old when he began to reign? 21 years old, and he reigned for 11 years. So as a vassal of Babylon, he's a little longer lived than his predecessor. His mother was Hamutal from 2 Kings chapter 24, and he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, like Jehoiakim had done, it says. This is what the Jewish Encyclopedia says about Jehoiakim. Okay, so this is who Zedekiah ruled in the likeness of. He was a godless tyrant who committed atrocious sins and crimes. He's portrayed as living in incestuous relations with his mother, daughter-in-law, and stepmother, and was in the habit of murdering men whose wives he then violated and whose property he seized. This is the rabbinical tradition about Jehoiakim. And Zedekiah was a ruler like Jehoiakim. So when we talk about violence, I mean just going in and killing men so you can have their property and violate their wives, doesn't get much more violent than that. He was arrogant against Jeremiah. When Jeremiah came to him to give him the word of the Lord, he rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. He hardened his heart against the Lord. He led an unfaithful regime of priests and officers. They were idolatrous, they polluted the temple, and they mocked God's prophets. This is all in verses 12 through 16 of 2 Chronicles 36. And then in verse 16, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people until there was no remedy. We've seen those words before when we talked about Israel. There was no remedy. God had tried everything, hadn't he? For because the anger of the Lord, from 2 Kings 24, it came to the point in Jerusalem and Judah that he cast them out from his presence. And those words are also repeated by Jeremiah. So Nebuchadnezzar returned when Zedekiah rebelled with the judgment of God. In the 9th year, and this is a day that has gone down in infamy for the Jewish people. It's a day of repentance for them even yet. In the 9th year, the 10th month, the 10th day of Zedekiah, Jeremiah chapter 52 and verse 4. He laid siege to the city, which lasted a year and a half. And I'd like to read that passage in Lamentations because it's so delightful. Even jackals offer the breast. They nurse their young, but the daughter of my people has become cruel like the ostriches in the wilderness, who I guess the analogy is that the ostriches walk off and leave their eggs and their young. The tongue of the nursing infant sticks to the roof of its mouth for thirst. The children beg for food, but no one gives it to them. Those who once feasted on delicacies perish in the streets. Those who were brought up in purple embrace ash heaps. For the chastisement of the daughter of my people has been greater than the punishment of Sodom, which was overthrown in a moment, and no hands were wrung for her. Her princes, we're talking about Judah again now, were purer than snow, whiter than milk. Their bodies were more ruddy than coral. The beauty of their form was like a sapphire. Now their face is blacker than soot. They are not recognized in the streets. Their skin has shriveled on their bones. It has become as dry as wood. Happier were the victims of the sword than the victims of hunger who wasted away, pierced by lack of the fruits of the field. The hands of compassionate women have boiled their own children. They became their food during the destruction of the daughter of my people. People do very strange things when they can't get any food for a year and a half. Finally, at the end of the year and a half, there was a breach made in the city wall. Josephus records that they had brought mules pulling iron axes to break down the wall. And they had been through all of the axes that were brought and couldn't break down the wall until the very last axe was laid, and they'd already been given the commandment to retreat and go home. The last axe was brought and the door was broken, and they finally breached the city. The men of war fled and were captured. The men of war in the city fled from the city and were captured. Zedekiah fled toward Arabah. He was captured in the plains of Jericho. He was brought to Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah, and I'll show you where Riblah is in just a second. He was sentenced there. His sons were slaughtered before his eyes, and it was the last thing he ever saw. His eyes were then put out. He was bound in chains and sent to Babylon and imprisoned there until his death. Here is a map to show you where Riblah is in comparison, relative to the rest of the Fertile Crescent. So here you have the Mediterranean Sea on this side and the Persian Gulf here. You have Jerusalem down here, and Riblah is just north, and it's on the path that people would take to get to Babylon, because you can't cross here. Only the Bedouin would dare attempt it. This is all the Arabian desert in this area. So it was common for people, even though it's way out of the way, people would have to go all the way up the coast and then all the way down in Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates to Babylon. So Nebuchadnezzar had set up an outpost here at Riblah after the Battle of Carchemish. So there was a strong military presence there, and that served as a kind of a headquarters for Nebuchadnezzar when he was on his campaigns. Now, it gives you some sense of just how strong Nebuchadnezzar's grip on Babylon and the entire kingdom were. If he could, so soon after he was made king, he could leave Babylon and go on these military campaigns for extended periods of time without uprisings back home. It's not that there weren't any, but they were so quickly put down that his rule was very firmly established even while he was away. And that's what Riblah looks like now. And this is from Farrell Jenkins' blog. This is a tell now. It's a mound that where successive layers of civilization have been mounded one upon top of another. This only happens in parts of the world where the erosion doesn't knock down the mound and the civilizations underneath. But after many, many years of building and destruction and people throwing away old construction debris and building on top of it, you get this mound, and now there's a cemetery on the top of the mound. But as you can see, it's wide open plain, and so it was a great place for military for a couple of reasons. One, because there's enough space for a large army, and another because this is an area that's fertile, and so the produce from this area was enough to sustain a military. Now let's turn our attention to Jerusalem. Didn't look all that fertile there, did it? People were killed with the sword in the sanctuary, the text tells us. Young men, maidens, aged, they didn't have respect of anybody. The Babylonians killed them all. Vessels and the treasures of the temple and palaces were brought to Babylon. Not just the main dwelling in the palace, but also the palaces of the princes. All of their dwellings were despoiled. It says then in 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and verse 19, and they burned the house of God and broke down the wall of Jerusalem and burned all its palaces with fire and destroyed all of its precious vessels. And this has been, not that we needed any confirmation archaeologically, but it has been confirmed archaeologically that there was fire throughout the city. There have been many excavations from this time period, and they all show signs of fire damage. Then comes in Nebuchadnezzar's cleanup man. Nebuzaradan was his captain of the guard. And so he comes in behind Nebuchadnezzar and carries away as slaves some of the poor, the remainder of the city dwellers, the deserters from the battle. So I suppose in just about any battle back then, you might have people who wanted to get out of the military. Maybe they weren't even Babylonian. There were some Greek mercenaries who worked for Nebuchadnezzar. If you ever wanted to bail out during a battle, it's a great time to do it. Well, they gathered all them up and hauled them back to Babylon as slaves. And also the artisans. There were a few of the poor left to keep the land and the vineyards. And that is if they didn't owe anybody anything. They didn't have any debt, I suppose, to Babylon. This is to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah. Until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths, all the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. So, all those years of Sabbaths that the land didn't have rest because the people of the land were grieving their God, now the land would have rest. All right, let's take a break right here. I'm about to launch into something completely, well, not totally unrelated, but something that will make a nice recap for the time that we've been studying all these kings. Anybody have any questions or comments that they'd like to make about what we've looked at in today's text? Pretty straightforward. We knew it was coming. We were told time and time again by several prophets, and now it has happened. And we kind of have a hint as to what's going to happen to Babylon, don't we? From a couple of other prophets that we have read from, and from Daniel and Ezekiel, who are still yet to come. To the point that, God had been so patient with them, to the point that when a prophet told them that Judah was going to be destroyed, what did they do? They laughed him to scorn. That was one of the complaints that Jeremiah had against the people, was that they were scoffing at the prophets who were coming to tell them that their destruction was imminent. Well, we have similar prophecies in the New Testament, don't we? How seriously do we take those prophecies that we have long taken for granted? Well, they won't happen in our lifetime. Well, maybe they won't. But let's not begin to ridicule them or scoff about them or tolerate others who do. I don't think anybody here would do that, but if you were tempted, just remember the lessons of Judah. What else you got? Yes, sir?
You mentioned in chapter 36, verse 16, the wrath of the Lord rose against his people till there was no remedy. I think that's really a key verse there.
Yeah.
He did everything possible. He
Yeah.
was patient until there was no option left.
Yes.
You know?
David returned to that passage that I put on the overhead about there not being any remedy. God had been patient, and he had done everything that could be done to try to restore Judah. When it was obvious that nothing could be done, his anger had built to the point where he destroyed them. And it is key. It is key to note that. We often comment about how the wrath of God, how strong he comes down on Judah and on Israel, and the cruelty with which these nations, it wasn't like God was himself doing these things, but he was standing by and allowing it to be done. Why? Because he had tried, and he tried, and he tried, and he tried to warn them, and he cried over them, and still they wouldn't listen to what he had to say. And when there was no remedy, he allowed it to be done. And when they come back from captivity, idolatry will have been purged from the land. And they will take some of these lessons about corruption and their lack of care for the poor. They'll take some of those to heart. It may not be permanent, it may not be in every generation, but people did learn lessons from this. And it was the faithful, and it was the remnant, those who believed in God, who were returned to the land under Jeremiah. Ezra and Nehemiah. What else? All right, I know you're dying to find out what this is about. Did Moses' prediction come true? This is what happens when you give a data guy a data set and you sit in at his computer one day. And I did this for the first time. I had to do it again because I lost it all, but I did it for the first time probably 30 years ago. And I just found it fascinating, so I thought I'd share it with you. This is what Moses said in Deuteronomy chapter 14 and verse 20. If you recall there was a whole series of commandments regarding the kings of the land and what the king should and shouldn't do when he came into his territory. I'm just going to go over there to Deuteronomy 17 and read that. We've got a few minutes here. I think we do. Yeah, we got plenty of time. Well. All right, so when you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. Nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. How many of these commandments that God had given them in Deuteronomy did they actually keep? And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of the law, approved by the Levitical priests. Remember, they'd a couple of times entirely lost the law for a period of time. They didn't know what law they were keeping because nobody was familiar with it, and they'd lost the book of the law. Every king was supposed to write for himself a copy of it. And it was supposed to be approved by the Levitical priest to show that he had done a good job copying, like a kid turning in his homework. The Levitical priest had to look at it, inspect it, and make sure that it was accurate. Yes, he has copied the entire law for himself. How many of those kings do you think had done that, especially at the time that they lost it? You know what? If I had made a copy of the entire law by hand, I don't think I would lose it. Knowing me, I might, but I don't think I would. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it in all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment, either to the right hand or the left. Why? The American Standard Version and some of the more literal versions make it a little more clear that he's talking about each king individually and the kings collectively, to the end that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. Why you want to do this? Because generally speaking, if you do what I tell you, you're going to live longer and you're going to reign longer. Now, did it happen? Well, here are the data. All right, so what I have down here is a rank, and I'll tell you where that rank came from. This is a rank of how good the kings are. The place I found this data set was in Halley's Bible Handbook. He's got a chart that tells each king how long he reigned and whether he was good or bad. And he uses a variety of descriptors to tell how bad the king, good or bad the king was. He uses a term like the best, or the worst, or good or bad, or mostly good, and then he throws in a couple of wicked and devilish. Okay, I'm not quite sure what to do with those in terms of ranking them, but I created a symmetrical ranking system with the best at the top and the worst at the bottom, and then in between, right at the middle, I divided them good and bad. Mostly good came right above mostly bad, and then they were separated from there, ranking them 1 through 8, okay? And so you have down here at the bottom, you have their rank, with 1 being the worst and 8 being the best king, okay? And you can see that there is a relationship. We're going to talk about how strong that relationship is in just a second. And then you got some weird stuff going on here, okay? Here's Manasseh sitting way up here, reigned for 55 years and was the worst of the kings. Why? Why does this happen? Well, there is variation from king to king, but what do you remember about Manasseh in his latter days? He repented. And God said, look how Manasseh has repented and how he's mourning for his sins. And God allowed him to live a longer life. Okay, so I'm going to take Manasseh out. He's an outlier. He doesn't fit in there anymore. Okay, now what we have left are these data right here. And you can see there's still quite a bit of scatter in the data points. But it seems to make a reasonably good linear fit. And I'm going to argue that it is a pretty good linear fit. Here are the stats. On average, the best king will outreign the worst one by 35 years. Based on that best fit line I showed you there on that chart. 35 years longer for the good kings than the bad ones. For each rank increase in goodness results in another 5 years. So if Halley said you were mostly bad, you live 5 years less long than the one who he said was mostly good. It's important that I didn't make up this data set myself. You understand? If I made it up myself, it would invalidate my statistics. I could bias them along the way. But because somebody else came up with them, I can't bias them. I just had to accept them. And I didn't know what the outcome of this was going to be. And you can't tell by looking at that data set what it's going to be entirely, can you? You can tell that there's probably a linear relationship there, but you can't tell how strong it is. The result is statistically significant at the 99.98% probability level, for those of you who care about these sorts of things. And the probability of this result based on chance is 1 out of 5,562. Based on chance alone, the chance of getting That difference between good kings and bad kings is 1 out of 5,562. That's it.
There was the lifespan during this time. 'Cause
Yeah, lifespan now is different than it was back then, and before them, it was a lot longer, wasn't it? Yeah,
we lived 700-800 years.
yeah, sure.
They were doing that during this.
No, well, this is all, within about a 350, 400-year time span, so the length of life probably hadn't changed much from the beginning to the end. And, all the kings of Israel are down here in this end of the graph. The only people you find up here are orange. They're all Judahites. The Israelites were all bad. They were just different degrees of bad, as they're recorded in the Bible. And we are actually told which kings were the absolute worst and which ones were the best, right? Josiah and Hezekiah are right up there they're the ones right up here at the top of the chart. It's just kind of fun. But I've presented that data set to a lot of people, and people tend to remember it. But did Moses' prediction come true, that if a king was good, he would live longer? And I didn't do the statistics where you couple the king with his sons. It said he and his sons. I didn't do that, but one might assume that because some of those dynasties in Israel were really short-lived, father and son, both snuffed out pretty quickly. I would guess that would probably also prove to be. We would also be able to prove that to be true, even though we accept it to be true without proving it. David?
I think the thing I take away from a lot of this is in Deuteronomy 17:14, when the people say, when it says, "I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me." They thought the nations around them had something better than what God had given them.
Yeah.
And there's a temptation for us to fall into that same way of thinking, that the world has something to offer that's better than what Christ has given to us. Especially, I think, as Lawrence has talked about, as Christianity becomes less of the cultural mainstream, there's going to be more pressure on us to say, well, maybe we're doing something wrong. Maybe
Yeah.
maybe the world has got it figured out and we don't. And that's something we need to be on guard about.
Okay. David was commenting about how in Deuteronomy 17:14 they wanted a king because they wanted to be like the nations. And they were no better off when they were like the nations than they were when they were just living under God, were they? And he said there would be a temptation for us to think, as people leave God more and more, and as our nation shifts away from God, there's a temptation to think that, well, maybe we've got it wrong and we should shift with them. But he's saying, no, the lesson that we learn here is that if you stick with God, you're going to be better off, regardless of what the nations around you do. And that would include the people of our own nation. So as pressure gets ratcheted up on Christians to abandon their faith, some will. But you can see what the outcome of that was for the children of Israel. Guy?
And we put a lot on the kings because they're the ones being talked about here. But
Yes.
we understand from our own personal, like what David was saying, that it's really us. It's the people. The people really run the country. The king just reflects that quite often.
Yes.
And as we see that in Josiah, as hard as he worked to reform, those reforms didn't take. And Manasseh, even pretending to think that he gained a great following, he didn't. Just on and on we see, even when the king was good, the people only followed him to a certain extent, that their hearts were never really changed.
Okay.
So, we can hope for a better government, pray for better government, but it's up to us to take care of our own communities and take care of our own people.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's true, that a nation's character is the character of all the people in the nation, not just the character of the leaders. And you may have a good leader over a bad nation at times, as these people did. And when Josiah came in, clearly the nation was steeped, so steeped in idolatry. Josiah's reforms wiped everything up from the top down, but it didn't cleanse the hearts of the people from the bottom up. And so the people, of course, are going to continue down their path. So it's great if we can have a godly leader, but a godly leader without a godly nation is going to be very short-lived. What else you got? Well, you know, I'm not too proud to end early. We run out of stuff to talk about, we'll just quit. Again, thank you all for hanging with me through my classes and for giving your support to these young guys who are getting their first opportunities to teach. And just thank you all.